I want, Sparky, for you to, can you tell us a little bit about the kind of usurious nature of some of the debt that gets accrued by people just because of how it compounds. I just want you to paint that picture a little bit if you can.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's complicated and it works a little bit differently from other debt. But, yes, the interest rates, many of them are very high, right? Some of them are not quite as high. Like I think some of the undergrad programs are maybe more in like the 3-4%. It changes over time. Congress has changed it a couple of times. Particularly the grad school debt. Like I expect most of your loans and most of my loans are from law school. That's like the real high, like 7.65. The point that I make on this, though, is that, most people are not paying anything, or almost. I think it's hard to parse the data exactly, but almost 50% of people are not even in repayment on their debt. They're in some other status. They're in deferment. They're in forbearance. They're in something. And then of the people who are in repayment, most of those people are on income-based repayment. And so they're not making whatever the full payment would be required to pay off their debt on the standard repayment term, which is 10 years. I would guess that the vast majority of those people are not even paying the amount of interest that's accruing on their debt. And one of the really, I think, fucked up parts about student debt, which is kind of unique, is that there's a feature, the interest doesn't automatically capitalize, right? So like when the interest accrues, it doesn't automatically get added to your balance. But anytime you switch statuses, it gets added to your balance. So what does that mean? That means like if you're, not making a ton of money and you're on income-based repayment and your required payments are 0, every single month your debt is accruing interest at whatever your interest rate is times whatever the total balance is divided by 12. If you ever, say, forget to fill out your annual income recertification, or if you fill it out and your servicer loses it, which they do all the time, or if your income increases, or, anything that happens, if you're making small payments but you miss a couple and you fall into delinquency or default, that giant interest balance that might have been accruing for years gets added onto your principal automatically. If you're in default and the interest is accruing and then you get out of default, you get back to like a good status, boom, interest added to your principal balance, along with oftentimes 18% collection costs, right? 18%. So this stuff, it really, like one of the clients who I mentioned, he has some public testimony and I'm okay to talk about this. His debt started as an $800 debt. And when I was helping him, it was more than $40,000.
Yeah.
How is that reasonable or possible? We're talking about 20 years of someone being, in and out of homelessness, in and out of unemployment, being hounded by debt collectors, and this $800 computer course suddenly is running your life for literally decades. It's fucking crazy.
So what could Joe Biden do about it? And what would you say to Democrats who say, well, this is just too expensive?
Yeah, I would love to have an argument about cost, actually. If any of you want to defend a $50,000 or a $10,000 plan, that would be really fun.
I'll do it. Look, you lazy bums. You decided to go to college. My kids went to trade school. It wasn't that expensive. You chose to go and read about, I don't know, Oscar Wilde and all of this flim flam when you really should have just been learning a trade.
I love flim flam. I'm pro flim flam.
Why should blue collar workers have to pay for the children of the wealthy to take gender communism courses at the university?
So I think that it's very frustrating that people still get confused about this, but people are still confused about this. When you talk about debt cancellation, you are not talking about the government writing a check to anybody. Right? The government owns the debt. People owe the government money. And so what the debt is, what cancellation is the government saying, in the future, we have the right to receive payments on this chunk of money. And we're basically just going to waive that. We're going to let it go. Right? And so when you hear people talk about this, they will talk as if the total outstanding amount of debt is the cost of canceling the total outstanding amount of debt.
Which is about, what, $1.7 trillion is the number that Bernie used to slap?
Nearly, I think, today. Okay. 1.8 is almost up to. That's not how debt works at all, right? Like, the cost of canceling or forgiving debt is almost never the amount that the debt is outstanding right now. Oftentimes for mortgages and stuff, it can be more. You expect to make interest on the debt over time. You wouldn't own the debt if all you were going to get was the principal balance back over 30 years, right? For the case of student debt, because so few people are paying it, and even fewer are paying anything close to something that will make it so that they will pay it off, and we've already got a bevy of forgiveness programs, from public service loan forgiveness to income-based repayment forgiveness to the goddamn death discharge, which is used pretty often and is going to be used a lot more, right? All of this is already forgiveness. So the cost of canceling student debt is not the balance. It's what the government can expect to make in the future from that debt. And we have very good reason to believe that number is very, very small. No one knows exactly what it is, but it's much, much, much less than $1.8 trillion.
So for every dollar, I mean, perhaps you have an estimate of this, for every dollar of student loan debt that the federal government holds in their, accounting of it, how many cents on the dollar do their own bookkeepers expect to get back?
I don't think there is an existing analysis of that, at least not a public one. There was a sort of macroeconomic analysis of debt cancellation done a couple of years ago by Marshall Steinbaum, Stephanie Kelton, I think Scott Fullerton, and one other person that I'm blanking on the name, I'm sorry, that was basically saying, okay, let's try to figure out, given about how much the federal government brings in on student debt and what we think the effects of cancellation would be, how this would sort of balance out. And what this analysis found is if you canceled all the debt, the government would actually make more money in the future on increased tax revenues than it's making on debt payments, because it would be so stimulative of the economy, it would increase employment, et cetera. It's kind of mind-boggling that people don't actually talk about this, because this is the only rationale that is ever given for any sort of tax policy, right? If you're ever going to argue for tax cuts, what you say is, well, actually, if we cut this tax, this is what the conservatives say. Actually, if we cut this tax, then the government revenue will increase because the economic activity will go up. Well, here we've got a legitimate, reliable macroeconomic analysis that says, more serious than a lot of those tax cut bullshit, that says that will actually apply for student debt. That if you want the government to have more money, you should cancel all student debt. And yet, people will still be out here talking about, but what's the cost of canceling? The cost of canceling student debt is less than the cost of keeping student debt.
So what is the stimulus effect of canceling student debt?
I will send you guys the paper, which you can review.
No, tell me. No, it
might be a little bit outdated. It's from February 2018.
This is not a reading show. We're talking about it.
What they found was basically that the I think the 5 to 10 year revenue would about match the projected revenue from student debt in that period, maybe a little bit more, and that employment would increase by, around half a percentage point. It's a macroecon paper. The headline is that it would be better on all fronts.
I just want to be clear what the actual process is that people are no longer having to pay the principal and interest on their debts, and that money, goes to other purposes.
Yeah, that money goes to other things. And also people are, freed up on their credit, right? They can buy, Bree can go out and buy a house if she wants.
A small studio apartment, but yes.
A small studio apartment, sure. I mean, wherever you are.
Those are the goals.
Your credit is free. And just, again, like I'm sometimes hesitant to talk about these sort of individual stories, because I think the problem is very systemic. And when you start to focus on individual stories, it gets people caught up in this, like, okay, but how, what kind of wonky trickery can we do to relieve the most serious harm, which I don't think is the right approach. But I will say again, I worked on this stuff as an attorney for a couple of years, just helping people with their student debt. And I had multiple clients who were doing like rideshare jobs because in their previous job, their student debt had caused their wages to be garnished.
Yeah.
And that was intensely stressful.
Yeah. And
basically they were like, well, if I do this rideshare job, they can't get to my income. Mm-hmm. Of course, they're still going to get to your taxes. It's not a perfect solution, but it's a humongous psychological weight on people, I think, that would be relieved.
This question about the cost and how much it'll cost is so insidious, because it sets up the sort of tenets of the argument in a way that's it's almost impossible to sort of reason out of or use logic or even, financial understanding, right? It like sucks all the sort of rhetorical logic out of the room, and it makes people not understand that this is not income actively coming into the federal government. And I think that's why debt jubilee is so powerful, right? Because it blows all of that up, right? And it makes you question kind of every other kind of debt that is used. Debt is a product, right? And that's the thing that people, I think student debt is so powerful because it's kids and it's education. And so you have a president that says education is a moral right. Education is a human right. We don't have anybody yet saying that necessarily about utilities, right? But we have a president saying that about education. Well, right. Some of us maybe.
I'll say that. I don't care.
But we don't have a president of the United States, who won by, he would maybe argue by sort of appealing to that, right? And so that's why when you finally understand that there is no sort of cost in the balance sheet way that most people understand, I wouldn't necessarily know how to read that macroeconomics paper, right, by Marshall Steinbaum. But
I'm reading it right now, and I'm having an
right.
easy time with it.
It's not that bad. It's really actually pretty clear
for me. Well, I'll just go to his Twitter and use that. But yeah, I mean.
Well, Bridget, can you explain debt jubilee? I don't want to get too far into this I think that's a really important point, but for people who haven't listened to Sparky's very informative episode on current affairs where he talked about this with Liz Bruning and Asher Taylor, what is the concept of a debt jubilee?
Most simply, it's a mass cancellation or elimination is really the most precise word of debt, meaning that it doesn't acknowledge a repayment, right? It's an elimination of the debt being held in the first place. So there's lots of different, the Debt Collective has a very specific idea of Jubilee and their plan for it. I'm actually reading the David Graeber book about debt from 2011 for the first time in full. And, Jubilee is a biblical term, right? It goes all the way back to, lending and borrowing in the very first iterations of these transactions as they are in like human history, which sounds overblown, but it's really not. Like these are, the way that we think about debt and our social investment in each other and what we owe from each other is riddled with financial and economic resonance that we don't even realize, right? So debt jubilee is like almost a celebration in linguistically, right, of that debt, which is why I another reason I find it really powerful, because it's like a communal embrace of, something forced, and it's like a communal release as well. So that's sort of like, that's how I would describe the kind of emotional reason for Jubilee over another term.
One of my favorite bits from the Graeber book is he basically describes every like lower class uprising for the last 5,000 years as having two basic demands, which is cancel the debt and redistribute the land. Right. This has always been the thing. And actually it kind of continues to be the thing because that's where the power is located.